Elon Musk, a name that almost everyone recognizes, is known for his groundbreaking achievements in technology, space exploration, and electric cars. But beneath his fame and success, Elon has always been someone curious about the way the world works. His mind is always thinking of new ways to approach problems and test ideas. One day, he thought of a challenge that might surprise many. He wanted to test how people treat the homeless, but instead of simply observing from afar, he wanted to experience it firsthand. To do so, he came up with a plan that was both daring and clever. Elon had been thinking about how people treat those in need, particularly the homeless. He had noticed how people often looked away or avoided them, and it made him wonder if there was more to be learned. He wanted to find out how a café, a place where people go for comfort, treats those who don't have the luxury of a home. What would happen if a person came in, looking rough, scruffy, and with no money in hand? Would they get the same treatment as any other paying customer? So Elon came up with the idea of disguising himself as a homeless person and visiting the café. It wasn't just about the test itself. It was about understanding human nature and the subtle ways we make assumptions about others. He knew it would be risky. What if the staff didn't treat him well? What if they made assumptions about him based on his appearance? But that's exactly what he wanted to understand. How would they treat someone who might not have the same privileges or status as others? Elon was no stranger to taking risks and stepping out of his comfort zone. But this was different. This wasn't about business or technology. This was about people. He wanted to see if the cafe's staff would judge him based on his appearance, or if they would offer the same kindness they would to any other person who walked through the door. To prepare for this test, Elon had to think through every detail of his disguise. It wasn't enough just to look the part. He had to act the part as well. He spent days gathering old clothes, shoes that looked worn out, and a scruffy wig to alter his appearance. He even practiced his body language in front of a mirror. Elon knew he had to look convincing. His usual confident and clean-cut appearance would only give him away. As he looked at himself in the mirror, he felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. It wasn't every day that someone as famous as him went to such lengths to blend into the background. But Elon wasn't afraid. He was determined to carry out this experiment, no matter how strange it might seem. He made sure his team knew nothing about the plan. This was something he wanted to do alone. After all, part of the experience was being anonymous and unrecognizable. With his disguise ready, Elon was about to step into the world in a way he had never done before. What would happen when the world saw him as just another person, struggling to get by? Would he be treated the same as others who didn't have his wealth or status? Elon's mind raced as he prepared to leave the house. He was ready for this test, but he couldn't help but wonder how things would unfold. He was about to discover a side of society that many people overlook, and he couldn't wait to see what he would learn. It was time to find out how people would treat someone like him if they didn't know who he was. The experiment was about to begin. Elon's excitement and nervousness mixed together as he stood before the mirror, ready to put on his disguise. He had prepared carefully for this moment, spending days collecting clothes and accessories that would help him blend into the background. He wasn't going to walk into the café looking like a famous billionaire. He had to look like someone who belonged to the streets, someone who would go unnoticed. The clothes he had chosen were simple: old jeans, a worn-out jacket, and shoes that had seen better days. The colors were dull, not too bright, and nothing that would attract attention. He knew the key to success in this experiment was subtlety. Elon wasn't someone who would normally wear clothes like this. In fact, his usual wardrobe was filled with suits and casual, well-tailored clothes. But today, all that had to change. His reflection was barely recognizable. His once perfect hair was now hidden beneath a messy, unkempt wig. He even added a fake beard to further alter his appearance. It wasn't just the clothes. It was the small details that made a difference, like the way he slouched his shoulders and walked with a slight shuffle, trying to give off the impression of someone worn out from life's struggles. He spent a few moments in front of the mirror, studying his reflection. The man staring back at him wasn't Elon Musk. It was someone else entirely. He looked like a person who had nowhere to go, someone who might sleep on a bench or in a doorway. He couldn't help but feel a little strange. This wasn't the version of himself he was used to seeing. But that's exactly what made the experiment so important. Elon wanted to understand how others would react to someone like him. Someone who had no status, no wealth, and no recognition. How would people treat him if they didn't know who he was? After a final check, he stepped away from the mirror and grabbed his bag, making sure to leave behind all his valuables. This wasn't about being cautious or guarded. This was about blending in, disappearing into the crowd. He left his house with a sense of anticipation, ready to head out into the world as an entirely different person. His car was parked outside, but today he wasn't going to drive. Instead, he decided to walk to the cafe, just like any other person who had no means of transportation. He wanted to experience everything from the ground up. The stares, the uncomfortable glances, and maybe even the indifference. As he made his way to the cafe, Elon couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. He was on the edge of a new adventure, one that would take him into unfamiliar territory. He was excited to see what he would discover, but he also felt a little nervous. Would people notice something was off? Would they give him the same treatment they would give anyone else, or would they treat him differently because of how he looked? He knew this experiment would reveal a lot about human nature, about kindness, judgment, and everything in between. When he finally arrived at the cafe, he stood outside for a moment, looking through the window. He took a deep breath, adjusting his disguise one last time. Then, with a final glance around, he pushed open the door and walked inside. The cafe was busy, filled with people chatting, sipping coffee, and going about their day. No one seemed to pay him any attention, which was exactly what he wanted. He moved toward the counter, trying to act casual, and prepared to see how the staff would respond to him. Would they treat him as just another customer, or would they judge him because of his appearance? As Elon entered the cafe, he felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with a sense of curiosity. He was now part of the crowd, but he wasn't like anyone else here. Most people were sitting at tables, absorbed in their conversations or lost in their own thoughts. A few sipped coffee, while others checked their phones. The cafe had the comforting hum of a place that felt familiar to most, a place where you could relax and take a break from the world. Elon couldn't help but notice how easy it was to slip in unnoticed. No one paid him a second glance. He approached the counter, trying to blend in as much as possible. His heart beat a little faster as he neared the barista. This was the moment of truth. Would they treat him like any other customer, or would his appearance make them think twice? The barista, a young woman with bright eyes and a welcoming smile, glanced up at him but didn't seem surprised by his appearance. She simply asked, "What can I get you today?" Elon, playing the part, responded with a quiet mumble, as if unsure of what to order. "Just a coffee," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The barista nodded without hesitation, taking his order and moving on to prepare his drink. There was nothing remarkable about the interaction, nothing that made him stand out. Elon couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. For a moment, he had become just another face in the crowd. As he stood to the side, waiting for his coffee, he watched the cafe's other patrons. Some were chatting with friends, while others were lost in their own world, typing away on laptops or flipping through books. A few people gave him brief glances, but no one seemed to pay much attention to him. It was as if he was invisible, just another person who came in for a quick drink. This was exactly what Elon had hoped for. His disguise was working, and it felt oddly liberating. But as the minutes passed, Elon began to notice something else. The way the staff treated him. It wasn't just the barista. The other employees, too, seemed indifferent to his presence. There were no smiles, no friendly conversation, just the routine of serving a customer. He stood there, feeling as though he were part of the background, his every movement unnoticed. He wasn't used to this. Normally, when he walked into a place, people would recognize him right away, and he'd be treated with a mix of admiration and curiosity. But now, there was nothing. No special treatment, no attention, just the humdrum of a normal cafe visit. When the barista handed him his coffee, she did so without much enthusiasm, offering him a quick "here you go," before moving on to the next customer. Elon took the cup, nodding in acknowledgement, but he couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Was this really how the world saw people like him? Was this how society treated those who had no status or wealth? The thought lingered in his mind as he walked to a nearby table, finding an empty seat in the corner. He didn't feel uncomfortable or out of place, but the experience was making him think deeply about the invisible barriers that existed between different groups of people. Sitting alone at the table, Elon took a sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the cafe. He had always known that there was a certain level of separation between the wealthy and the less fortunate, but now, in this moment, it felt so much more real. He had always been on the other side, someone who was recognized, who had the privilege of being treated with respect and admiration. But today, he was just another face in the crowd, and that, in itself, was a powerful realization. As Elon sat at his table, sipping his coffee and observing the world around him, he began to notice more subtle details. There was a certain distance between him and the people in the cafe. It wasn't that anyone was being rude. It was the way people seemed to avoid acknowledging him. It wasn't the usual friendly smiles or curious glances he was used to. Instead, there was a quiet detachment, as though he were invisible. The barista, after serving him, had quickly moved on to the next customer without a second thought. It wasn't that she was unkind, but there was a clear difference in how she treated him compared to the way she spoke to others. With every person who walked up to the counter, she greeted them warmly, asking if they wanted anything else or striking up a quick conversation. But with Elon, there was no extra effort. She took his order, gave him his coffee, and that was the end of it. The same happened with the other staff members. They seemed to go about their work without paying him any attention. Elon was puzzled. This wasn't how he expected it to be. He had imagined the staff might look at him differently, perhaps even treat him with some sympathy, considering how many people viewed homelessness. But instead, they treated him just like any other customer. In a way, he could appreciate the professionalism. They weren't showing pity, nor were they making assumptions about who he was or where he came from. But at the same time, it made him feel distant. He was just another person in the crowd, and in some ways, that felt more isolating than anything he had experienced before. Around him, the cafe continued to hum with activity. The sounds of soft chatter, the clink of cups, and the hum of the espresso machine filled the air. People seemed focused on their own lives, absorbed in their conversations, their laptops, or their phones. No one seemed particularly interested in anyone else. Elon watched as a few customers exchanged brief pleasantries with the barista, laughing at a joke or asking how her day had been. It made him realize that the connection people shared with one another was far more complex than he had ever thought. These small, casual interactions were what built the sense of community in places like this. But here he was, sitting at a table alone, unnoticed and disconnected from the world around him. The longer Elon stayed, the more he observed how people interacted with each other. There were moments of warmth, a smile, a shared joke, but they seemed to be reserved for those who didn't look out of place. The homeless were often invisible in this world, not just in the literal sense, but also in the way society treated them. He couldn't help but wonder if this was how most people felt when they found themselves without a home, wandering the streets with no one acknowledging their existence. Elon had always been at the top, in control, and admired by many. But today, sitting in this cafe, he was learning a valuable lesson about human nature and the invisible lines that separated people. As he finished his coffee, he felt a mix of emotions. He was grateful for the experiment, for the chance to step into someone else's shoes, but he also felt a sense of sadness. The world, it seemed, wasn't as kind as he had hoped. There was a distance between people, a subtle divide that went unnoticed by most, but one that had been made painfully clear to him today. His experiment wasn't just about testing how he would be treated. It was about understanding how society viewed those who were often forgotten. And while he hadn't experienced overt rudeness or hostility, the indifference he encountered was a powerful reminder of the gaps that existed between different groups of people. As Elon sat there, lost in his thoughts, something unexpected happened. The quiet hum of the cafe was interrupted by a voice, one that seemed genuinely interested in him. A woman, a cafe employee who had been quietly moving between tables, approached him with a warm, kind smile. She wasn't the barista who had taken his order, but rather someone else who had noticed him sitting alone. She looked at him for a moment before saying, "Hey, you seem a little down. Is everything okay?" Her tone was casual but full of empathy, as though she truly cared. For a moment, Elon was caught off guard. This was the first time anyone had really acknowledged his presence in such a direct way. It wasn't the indifference he had grown used to. It was an open question, a sign that someone saw him as more than just a customer. Elon hesitated. He hadn't expected anyone to approach him, let alone someone showing kindness without any strings attached. He quickly realized that this could be a turning point in his experiment. Would he reveal his true identity now, or would he continue with the act? He decided to play along for a little longer, to see where this interaction would go. "I'm fine, just thinking," Elon responded, trying to sound as natural as possible. He looked up at her, making sure not to break character. He didn't want to give away his true identity just yet, but something about this conversation felt different. She wasn't just being polite. There was a real curiosity in her voice, a desire to understand. "Thinking about what?" she asked, sitting down at the table across from him. Her body language was open and welcoming. She wasn't treating him like a stranger or someone to avoid. She was treating him like a person, someone worth talking to. Elon considered his answer carefully. He wasn't used to this level of attention, especially not when it came from someone who didn't recognize him. "Just life, you know. It can be tough sometimes," he said quietly, his eyes focusing on his coffee cup. He didn't want to make it sound like he was looking for sympathy, but he also didn't want to downplay the complexity of the situation. The woman nodded, her expression softening. "Yeah, I get that. Sometimes it feels like we're all just going through the motions, trying to get by. It can be hard to connect with people, you know." Her words resonated with him. It was a simple statement, but it hit closer to home than he expected. It wasn't just about homelessness. It was about the disconnect that many people felt in the world today, no matter who they were or what their situation might be. She paused for a moment, as if reflecting on her own experiences. "I think people forget that everyone has a story. They see someone and make assumptions based on how they look, but we're all just people trying to make it through the day." Elon couldn't help but be moved by her honesty. There was something refreshing about her perspective. Unlike the others in the cafe, she didn't look at him with judgment or indifference. She saw him as more than just someone in a disguise. And in that moment, he felt seen in a way that he hadn't expected. It wasn't the way he usually felt, especially not as a famous entrepreneur, but there was something profoundly humbling about being treated with such genuine curiosity. He couldn't hold back his smile anymore. "You're right," he said, finally letting down the act a little. "Sometimes people don't realize how much they miss by not taking the time to really look at others." He still wasn't ready to reveal his identity, but he felt a sense of gratitude toward this woman. She was reminding him of something important: the value of human connection, the kind that went beyond appearances and assumptions. The woman smiled back, clearly satisfied with their conversation. She didn't press him for more details or ask any invasive questions. Instead, she simply said, "I hope things get better for you. Don't be afraid to reach out if you ever need someone to talk to." With that, she stood up and walked away, leaving Elon to sit in contemplation. He was left with a feeling of connection, something he hadn't expected to find in such a simple moment. For the first time since the experiment began, Elon realized that not all people would judge him by his appearance. Some, like this woman, would take the time to see him for who he was, regardless of the disguise. It was a small but powerful reminder that empathy and kindness could still be found, even in the most unlikely places. As the day wore on, Elon couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. The conversation with the cafe employee had been a turning point in his experiment. It had made him realize how easily people could slip into judgment based solely on appearances. And yet, it was this one woman's kindness and curiosity that stood out. She had treated him like a human being, not just someone who appeared to be struggling. It had been a small interaction, but one that had a profound impact on him. He was beginning to understand the depth of what he had come here to discover. Still, there was more he wanted to learn. Elon wasn't content with just one meaningful interaction. He wanted to see if the kindness he had experienced was an exception or if it was something more common. His experiment was far from over, and he knew there was more to uncover. With that thought in mind, he decided to take a different approach. The next step in his plan was simple but risky. He would try to reveal just a little more about himself. Not enough to give away his true identity, but enough to see if anyone would treat him differently once they believed he wasn't just a homeless man. Elon had been careful until now, keeping his disguise intact. But now he wanted to test whether the kindness he had experienced was something deeper, or whether people would simply respond to him because he no longer appeared to be in need. Elon walked up to the counter again, this time a bit more confident. He had finished his coffee and was ready to take the next step in the experiment. As he approached, the same barista from earlier looked up. She didn't seem to recognize him at first, but her smile was polite, just like before. "Can I get you something else?" she asked, her tone neutral. This was his chance. Elon hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a low voice. "Actually, I just wanted to say, I've been sitting here for a while now, and I've been thinking about something. It's funny how people treat others based on their looks, isn't it?" The barista glanced at him curiously, but didn't respond immediately. She wiped down the counter, waiting for him to continue. Elon could see that she wasn't sure what to make of his words, but she was still listening. This was a different response than he had expected, and it gave him a moment of hope. He decided to keep going. It's like, people don't really look beyond the surface. They see someone who's dressed a certain way or looks a bit rough, and they assume things. But the truth is, everyone has a story. I think we forget that sometimes. The barista paused for a second, looking at him thoughtfully. "Yeah," she said, her voice softening. "I think you're right. It's easy to judge someone by the way they look, but we don't always know what's going on in their lives." Her words struck a chord with Elon. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show him that there was a deeper level of understanding that people could have, if they were willing to listen. The interaction wasn't as warm as the one he'd had with the woman earlier, but it was more than he had expected. It was proof that some people were willing to think beyond the surface. But just as Elon began to feel a sense of accomplishment, he noticed something that surprised him. A few people in the cafe, who had been sitting nearby, had started to pay more attention to him. They were glancing his way, whispering to each other, and even staring a little longer than was comfortable. It seemed like they were intrigued by his conversation, but also cautious. Elon couldn't help but wonder if they had begun to suspect that something wasn't quite right. The barista finished cleaning the counter and returned to her duties. Elon stood there for a few moments, reflecting on what had just happened. The experiment had already shown him a lot: how people judged based on appearances, how some were willing to show kindness, and how others were hesitant to engage with someone they didn't understand. He realized that the world wasn't as simple as he had once thought. There were many layers to how people interacted with each other, especially when it came to those who were struggling. The kindness he had witnessed today was something worth holding on to, but there was also the reality that many others were more likely to turn away than to reach out. With his coffee now finished, and the cafe feeling less inviting, Elon stood up to leave. His experiment wasn't over, but it had already taught him more than he had expected. There was no simple answer, no clear conclusion. But there was one thing he knew for sure. The world needed more moments of connection, moments where people saw each other for who they truly were, not just for what they appeared to be. And perhaps that was the lesson he was meant to take away from this experience. As Elon stepped outside the cafe, the cool breeze hit his face, and he felt a mixture of emotions swirling inside him. The experiment had been eye-opening, and although he hadn't revealed everything just yet, he felt like he had learned more than he anticipated. There was still more to explore, but today had given him a lot to think about. Elon stood there for a moment, taking in the street before him. People rushed by, lost in their own worlds, just as they had been inside the cafe. He wondered how many of them had truly seen each other, or if they, too, were simply caught up in the noise of their daily routines. He had planned to leave the cafe and move on with his day, but something made him hesitate. The employee, the one who had talked to him so kindly earlier, had left a lasting impression. He thought back to the conversation they had shared. Her words had stuck with him. She had understood, in some small way, the complexity of human connection and how easily it could be overlooked. Elon had been on the receiving end of kindness, and it made him question how often he had missed opportunities to connect with others in his own life. After a brief pause, Elon turned around and walked back into the cafe. The same atmosphere greeted him, the murmur of voices and the clinking of cups, but this time he felt a little different. This wasn't about being anonymous anymore. He wasn't just here to observe. There was something more important he had to do. He felt a pull, an urge to see if he could make a deeper connection with the people who had unknowingly played a part in his experiment. He walked up to the counter, where the barista who had been serving him earlier was now chatting with another customer. Elon waited for a moment, unsure of what he was going to say, but feeling that this was the right time to reveal just a little bit more of himself. When the barista finally noticed him, she gave him a polite smile. "Back for more?" she asked. Elon smiled back, but this time, his smile was different. It was genuine, something that came from the heart. "Actually," he said, his voice steady, "I wanted to thank you for earlier. You were really kind to me, and I appreciated it more than you know." The barista looked surprised, but she returned his smile. "Oh, I'm glad you're okay. Sometimes it's hard to know how to help someone, but I just thought, maybe a little kindness goes a long way, you know." Her words struck him again. Here was someone who understood, someone who didn't just see the surface but saw the possibility of a deeper connection. It wasn't the big things that mattered. It was the small moments, the simple act of being kind without asking for anything in return. Elon stood there for a moment, trying to decide if he should tell her the truth. But he quickly realized that now wasn't the time. He didn't need to reveal his identity to make a difference. In fact, revealing who he was might distract from the message he wanted to share. So instead, he simply nodded and said, "I think you're right. It's the little things that matter most." The barista looked at him curiously, but instead of pressing him for more information, she simply offered a warm, understanding smile. "I hope everything works out for you," she said, turning her attention back to the counter. As Elon left the cafe again, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had learned more in the last few hours than he had expected. The kindness that had been offered to him without question, the genuine connection he had felt, it was all a reminder that the world, for all its flaws, still had a lot of good in it. And maybe, just maybe, it was moments like these that could change things. Elon had come into this experiment to see how people would treat him, but in the end, he realized it wasn't just about how others saw him. It was about how he saw the world around him. People, no matter their circumstances, deserved to be seen for who they truly were. And today, he had seen that, even in a world that often overlooked the small things, there were still plenty of opportunities to make a real connection. The day had taught him more than any meeting with a CEO or investor ever could. And as he walked away from the cafe, He felt a renewed sense of gratitude, not just for the kindness he had received, but for the reminder that sometimes the simplest acts of humanity were the most powerful. As Elon continued walking, he couldn't help but think about everything that had transpired. His experiment was, in many ways, more than just a simple test of human interaction. It had been a journey of self-reflection. When he first entered the cafe, he had been prepared for judgment, for coldness, or perhaps indifference. He had expected to blend in with the crowd and learn from the reactions of others. But what he had discovered went far beyond what he had anticipated. The people he encountered, especially the barista who had been so kind, had shown him something he hadn't fully appreciated before: the power of genuine connection. It wasn't about grand gestures or deep conversations. It was the small moments of kindness, the brief exchanges that made people feel seen, heard, and valued. He had realized that the true test wasn't how others treated him, but how people treated one another, no matter who they were or what they looked like. Elon had come into this experiment wanting to see how society would react to someone who appeared homeless. He wanted to understand the biases and judgments that so often shaped how people interacted with one another. But what he hadn't expected was to find a sense of humanity that was deeper than he'd imagined. It was easy to overlook, easy to dismiss in a busy world, but it was there. And that, he realized, was the most important thing to take away from this experiment. Walking back to his car, he felt a sense of calm that he hadn't experienced in a long time. The air felt fresh, and the world around him seemed just a little bit brighter. It was as if he had seen a side of life that had been hidden from him before, and now that he had discovered it, he couldn't help but feel grateful. He thought about how easy it was for people to go through their days without acknowledging the struggles of others. It wasn't intentional. Most people simply didn't think about it. They were caught up in their own routines, focused on their own lives. But if there was one thing Elon could take away from today, it was this: people were more than just the labels society gave them. He wondered how he could use his own influence to help bring more attention to this. How could he make people more aware of the small ways they could make a difference? He thought about the many projects he had worked on, the ways in which technology had the potential to change the world. But today, he realized that sometimes change didn't need to come from technology or grand innovations. Sometimes change could come from something as simple as a kind word or a smile, something that everyone could offer. The lesson was clear to him now. The way we treat others, especially those who are often overlooked, mattered more than anything else. It wasn't just about fixing problems or making things more efficient. It was about making people feel seen, no matter their circumstances. Elon knew he couldn't change the world overnight, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was more determined than ever to use his platform, his voice, to encourage others to look beyond appearances and recognize the humanity in everyone. By the time he reached his car, Elon felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The experiment had ended, but its impact would stay with him. He had come looking for answers, but what he had found was something more profound: a reminder of the simple, powerful acts of kindness that could change lives. And that, he realized, was the most important thing to carry forward.